Welcome to this video where we're doing a case study what I'm calling pilot psychology with sick engines. For the record, I'm filming this on January 15th of 2021. Instead of doing one case study about one particular incident, we're going to do very quick case studies about a total of 6 incidents, not spending too much time on any one of them while we try to understand pilot psychology. Full disclosure about 3 things. First of all, some of the people involved in these incidents were killed, and so we're certainly going to treat these incidents with a lot of respect. Number 2, and this is a small item, full disclosure, 2 of the incidents are going to take place in an area where I grew up, where I have family to this day, and where I learned to fly, and so I am very familiar. It's not going to particularly affect what I'm talking about. It will inform some of the discussions I have about the decision-making processes that were taking place at the time. And then full disclosure, item number 3, I slightly lied to you about the title. We are going to talk about pilot psychology when engines are getting sick, let's say, in airplanes with rough-running engines, oil pressure problems, and the like. Not because we're interested in changing pilots' actions during these events, which I am. Okay, I do talk to pilots in different venues and so on about how they should be when they have a problem. They should be quicker to declare an emergency. But for purposes of this video, we are here more to observe what pilots do in some cases, whether we like it or not, so that we can understand how we should be responding on our side of the microphone. Also, because the problem that pilots have in these situations is really a manifestation of a common human problem in some cases, I am also going to argue that we're going to be talking about controller psychology during some of these events, how we need to up our game. So let's get started. As far as the PowerPoint goes, this is pretty simple. This is the only slide I'm going to use. It's just really a placeholder to kind of get us to these 6 incidents. Let's jump right in with the first one. First one involved a Piper Cherokee in Farmingdale, New York. He's only a mile or so from the airport, couple thousand feet up, with somebody who's receiving an introductory lesson. I'm not absolutely certain whether the flight instructor who had the GoPro installed was giving somebody their very first lesson or whether it was truly an introductory flight and so on. In any case, we're going to pick up roughly 27 minutes into the half-hour plus video and watch just a little bit. So let's get started.
Ooh, I don't like this. See what's happening there? Look at that. See what's happening there?
Yeah.
Something is not right. See all the oil spitting out?
Yeah.
And Cherokee 6913 Foxtrot would like to come back in for landing.
Cherokee 13 Foxtrot, roger. Did you make a 180 there?
Affirmative, would like to get clearance back for landing.
Cherokee 13 Foxtrot, roger. Making another 180, descend to pattern altitude and join the right downwind runway 32.
Another 180, join the right downwind 32, 13 Fox.
10 Papa has traffic turning base.
Cherokee 10 Papa, number 2 behind the Cessna, runway 32, cleared to land.
Clear land behind the Cessna, 10
See the oil?
Oh, yeah.
Oil's coming out of the engine. I don't know what's happening.
I'm going to pause for a second so you can kind of get your bearings. If you look over here in the 1 o'clock direction, we're looking to the northwest, and that's runway 32 out there. So he's been told to make another 180, descend down to pattern altitude, make right traffic for 32. There's no indication of a problem to the controller and so on. He is not going to follow the instructions that he was given and read back. He's going to go across the final. You'll see that in a minute and watch how the controller responds. By the way, the controller did a wonderful job in this whole incident.
Ventura 6, we're holding short of runway 32.
Ventura 6, Republic Tower.
Close it
Runway
tight.
32, cleared for takeoff, minimum delay on your departure roll, Cessna traffic,
Close it
mile and a half
tight. When
final.
you
Ventura 6,
the oil check.
takeoff. Fast as possible.
Okay.
Wind check.
Wind 26011, gusting 19er. Cessna 68 Bravo 1, departure prior to your arrival, Cherokee full length on the roll.
Roger, traffic inside, 68 Bravo.
Archer 13 Foxtrot, you appear to be crossing final.
Yes, sir. We're joining the right downwind. You said join the right downwind for 32?
Well, sir. Traffic is just off your left side, 600 feet on final.
Archer 13 Foxtrot, make a left turn to join the left downwind.
I thought you said join the right downwind for 32. Okay, you want to do a left turn for the left downwind 32, sir?
13 Foxtrot, I wanted you to join the right downwind, but you crossed final into the left downwind now, so turn left, join the left downwind for runway 32. You have traffic 12 o'clock in a mile, 900 feet in the left downwind.
Okay, copy that. 13 Foxtrot joining the left downwind to runway 32.
Cherokee 49 Romeo, traffic 11 to 12 o'clock, 900 feet, making a left turn to join the left downwind, red and white Cherokee.
We're going to 549 right now.
649 Romeo, roger, follow the Cherokee. Go. Cherokee 1 Sierra Papa, still clear to land, number 2, runway 32.
Roger, thank you. Clear land, 1 Sierra Papa.
Archer 1-3 Foxtrot, I'll call your base.
1-3 Fox.
Attention all aircraft, public for information, Golf, now current altimeter 29902.
I'm going to pause for just a second. So now he's kind of slotted him in on the left downwind. The pilot has said nothing about the problem other than just he wants to return. That could be for any reason. So it's it's totally innocuous. But what happens is now the controller's like, I'm going to call your base. By extension, what you understand is that means he's going to go farther out from the runway before he turns back. If the engine were to fail totally at this point, just south of Farmingdale, the pilot does not have any meaningfully good forced landing options.
Archer 1-3 Foxtrot, turn base, runway 32, clear to land.
Runway 32, clear to land, turning base, 1-3 Fox.
Archer 1-3 Foxtrot, you appear to be leaving a vapor trail. Are you having any issues?
Well, it looks like we're getting some oil coming out of the cowling here, so that's why we'd like to come back for landing.
Roger, just if that was the reason you wanted to come back originally, just let us know that as soon as possible. You're clear to land runway 32. Do you need any assistance once you touch down?
Negative assistance. We're just going to come in for landing on runway 32, 1-3 Fox.
I'm going to end the video here. I'll just leave it freeze frame while I comment on this for a second. Absolutely agree with the controller 100%. Pilots, if you have a problem, and I know this is a video for controllers, but I'm still going to address pilots. Pilots, if you have a problem, the sooner you let us know, the better for a couple of reasons. Number one, even if you end up flying the same pattern, more or less, we are not going to be calling your base. We're going to give you the option of staying closer into the airport. Number two, we're not going to have maybe somebody, pull out on the runway with a lineup and wait operation and so on. Because here's what happens. Sometimes what will happen is this pilot says, I'm fine, is what they're thinking. I don't need to declare an emergency. I am going to return. I mean, I'm a smart, prudent pilot, right? But I don't need to declare an emergency. Well, the fact is this pilot does not know what the cause of the problem is, and he doesn't know how extensive it is. If you watch the full video from this point forward, there is a comment he makes to this student at one point that the oil pressure is still fine. I'll take him at his word, even though I can't read the gauge from this GoPro video view. All right, but you don't know what the problem is, and even if it starts off as a slow leak, it can develop into a bigger problem and lead to quick catastrophic engine failure. In a worst case scenario, granted it's unlikely, you can have oil going out onto the hot engine and you have an engine fire, and now we've taken somebody out farther away. Now, a pilot might say, oh yeah, but it wasn't a problem. If it worsens, I'll declare the emergency then. Well, here's the problem. Even if you think you're going to do that when you're downwind abeam from the pilot's perspective, again, the controller might have somebody who's on a half-mile final, might have somebody else who's getting ready to do a lineup and wait or something like that, and suddenly that pilot who's downwind abeam says, mayday, mayday, I'm coming back into land, I'm exercising my PIC authority because I'm in charge here, right? Well, it takes a few seconds for controllers to get other pilots out of the way, and I am opposed to taking that pilot on short final and just giving them a go-around unless we really have to, okay, and that creates totally unnecessary risk that gets added to other pilots and so on, plus, for what it's worth, extra stress at some level to controllers. If this guy, when he first had the oil pressure problem, had acknowledged that he didn't know what the problem was, but he's got an oil pressure, he's got an oil leak in this case, or he's got a rough running engine, he declares an emergency. He can still stay calm if he wants, but it improves the odds. Now, it turns out this guy gets away with it just fine. The problem is, if the engine had failed just a few seconds before I paused it here and this guy had to make a forced landing, we would all rightfully be criticizing him. And so I just want you to understand, pilots sometimes, what this is, and I'm just going to be blunt and frank about it, this is a manifestation of kind of two of the hazardous attitudes at least. One is macho and one is kind of invulnerability. It seems like it's minor. I don't know what the problem is, but we're just going to fly. We're going to sound nice and cool on the frequency and so on. that's for controllers just something to understand. That's what pilots do. All right, let's go back to PowerPoint real quick. The second one we're going to look at, by the way, they made it out fine and so on. The second one here is a Cessna 172 engine failure northwest of Deer Valley in 2018. We're going to watch just a couple minutes of the Voz Aviation YouTube video, and let's get started. I'll pause for 1 second. So you read this and it sounds like he's inbound for a full stop landing, and suddenly the engine fails. Ah, the poor luck. The pilot has to land in the desert because he's not able to reach the airport, and the aircraft comes to rest inverted. Everybody gets out with just minor injuries. However, there's more to the story. You just won't see it in the video here. Video is still quiet for a couple seconds, and it'll be quiet at the start. He's going to go northwest, and he's going to do a couple laps around a lake up here called Lake Pleasant, just north of a dirt strip known as Pleasant Valley Airport. So he does a couple laps. He's now going to come back.
Cessna 154, Mike Echo, Deer Valley Tower.
Deer Tower, Cessna 154, Mike Echo, we are 8 miles northwest of Deer Valley, bound the first stop India.
Cessna 4, Mike Echo, make one left 360 for sequencing, and then enter left station way 7 left, report Canal Freeway.
Make one left 360 and report Canal Freeway 7 left, 154 Mike Echo.
Cessna 4, Mike Echo, say intention.
Request first stop for Mike Echo.
Deer Valley Tower information India, wind 160 at 5, altimeter 29901.
Deer Valley Tower, Cessna 154 Mike Echo, we have emergency landing.
I'll show you the shooting range in a minute.
Decide the shooting range for Mike Echo.
This 4 Mike Echo, verify you're doing another 360.
Actually, we have actual emergency landing for Mike Echo. We have engine stop, engine failure.
Cessna 4 Mike Echo, verify it's engine failure.
Affirmative for Mike Echo.
4 Mike Echo, roger, proceed inbound. Can you make it to the field?
Negative, we need to force landing for Mike Echo. Beside the I-17.
I'll pause there. I will note before we leave it, if you noticed a couple seconds earlier what the tower had said, proceed inbound, and can you make it to the field? I'm going to show you some things that are relevant to that. At first glance, that does not seem at all wrong with what the controller does. We're going to get a little more advanced. We're going to try to improve the way we do things and see how reasonable this is, and so on. The last thing I'll do is I'll just catch a freeze frame here of the inverted airplane when they struck a rock during the rollout in the relatively decent desert terrain. Nonetheless, the airplane ended up inverted. But for more of the story, let's go to the NTSB preliminary report. That's the current status. There is no final report now, even though it's been 2.5 years. Maybe the NTSB needs to get some extra money in their budget and hire some new people. But anyway, so this is the summary. They were maneuvering, they were circling the lake at about 5,000 feet. MSL, that's ballpark 3,500-ish AGL. I'm familiar with the local terrain. Suddenly, the vacuum annunciator lights illuminated and the engine immediately experienced roughness. So you don't see that on the video. This guy has a rough running engine. He decides to head back towards Deer Valley. He did not report an emergency or the engine roughness to ATC because he didn't anticipate a loss of engine power. That pilot in Farmingdale gets away with his decision. This pilot, it turns out, doesn't. Now, he does do some things. He plays with the mixture, the fuel boost pump. However, the engine continues to run rough. And when he's about 8 miles northwest of Deer Valley, as he's descending, he's told by Tower to perform a left 360. That's perfectly fine from the Tower's perspective. Tower has no idea that this guy has a problem and so on. Okay, and after completing the turn, kind of by coincidence, that's when the engine loses power, the propeller stops rotating. So this was a catastrophic engine failure, and then to his credit, at least at this point, the pilot now does configure the airplane for best glide, finds the best suitable landing site in that area. For all intents and purposes, it was a very good forced landing site, and he updated ATC about his situation. And if you watch the full video, because I stopped it partway through, Tower, among other things, does send some airplanes over there to find out how the airplane is doing, but witnesses on the ground saw it go down and looked at it. So let's go to Google Maps and kind of inform our understanding of the situation. So here's Deer Valley Airport down here. Okay, the pilot had taken off, had gone northwest, had done a couple laps of Lake Pleasant, had the rough running engine, comes back. The shooting range is a well-known local thing. Surprised the label's not coming up, but this is the Ben Avery shooting facility and so on. So it's actually, I believe, for ATC purposes, I'd have to look it up. I believe on the sectional it's marked as a kind of a visual checkpoint. It's well known in the area. But the pilot was over about here when he informed the controller that he had the engine failure. He ends up in desert terrain, approximately over here, more or less a beam Dove Valley Road. They haven't built this out yet. And so people did see him go down. And so it was not a bad forced landing spot. Because it was accessible to rescuers. Witnesses saw him and so on, even with the flip. But anyway, when he first has the engine failure, what's the intuitive reaction that the controller has? It's something like proceed inbound. Now, that's not unreasonable. Most controllers would find no fault with that. I, per se, don't find fault with that. However, I would like us to all up our game. It's easier said than done. I absolutely get that. But think about the options here. So the pilot has an engine failure, and if you're a controller at Deer Valley, you're going to be familiar with this area. So basically, you know, here's the airport down here, okay, and the last 3 or 4 miles in is basically kind of a built-up urban area. There may or may not be some suitable forced landing sites on the way in, but those last 3 or 4 miles are pretty rough. At the time, the guy's over in an area that's actually fairly wide open, and for what it's worth, there are some very decent forced landing possibilities. So just know your airspace, know what your options are, and so on, and don't necessarily be locked into the idea that we should send them to airports. I think that's actually a manifestation of this problem when it presents to controllers. Try to keep an open mind. This is going to have to be something you do more like in advance when you're talking about the options that you have, especially for rough running engine situations and whatnot, is don't necessarily commit to going to an airport, because an airport can sometimes be kind of a double or nothing proposition. If you head in, if you make it, hey, that's great, you ended up at a place where the mechanics are, right? However, if you don't make it, what is it like within the last couple miles? Now, if the airplane is coming from the south down here, you might as well say proceed inbound. There's nothing good anywhere in here. You might as well, attempt the airport. There's no heightened risk going in. But if somebody's up here, there is heightened risk coming in that last little bit. Again, easier said than done to think through the options. That's why you have to think about them in advance. But there, you might start to say something like, depending on how well you know the area, okay, proceed inbound. We'll clear you to land if you want it. But can you guarantee you can make the airport? If not, what do you have for a forced landing site on the way before you overfly an urban area? Stuff like that is worth discussing and so on. Okay, I'm going to leave that one there for discussion purposes. Okay, let's go back to this. The next one, there is no video associated with it. It is coincidentally another airplane. This time it was a brand new Mooney. The thing was only about a month old. I don't know that affects the situation so much. Coincidentally, it was also northwest of Deer Valley, and it was almost exactly 1 year later. So we did look at the NTSB report for this airplane. It was June of 2018, almost exactly 1 year later in June of 2019. You had a brand new Mooney Acclaim Ultra that had taken off from Scottsdale, okay, on an VFR flight plan for the cross-country flight up to Carson City, Nevada. And so he was talking to controllers at the time, about 7 minutes after departure. He was about 8 miles northwest of Deer Valley, so coincidentally, approximately the same place as the 172 we were looking at a minute ago, although he was at a higher altitude. He was at 9,100 feet. The pilot reported a rough running engine and subsequently declared an emergency. For context, keep in mind, I've kind of shifted, and now we're going to look more at controller psychology. It's going to mingle with pilot psychology a little bit. Okay, but he declares an emergency. The controller offered the pilot Pleasant Valley Airport, Papa 48, which was near his position, and also Glendale Municipal Airport, 12 miles south of his position, for possible landing airports. The pilot chose Glendale and turned to the south and lined up for the approach to runway 19. Now let's think about this for a second. So he's bypassing the closer airport for something farther, going 12 miles instead of something nearby and so on. But if you paid attention to where we are geographically, he's going for something that's ballpark 12 miles south, What about Deer Valley, which is 8 miles southeast? Let's go back to the Google Maps, and I'm going to jump first of all into FlightAware, and this shows the track of the airplane. So he had taken off from Scottsdale, okay, had gone practically right over Deer Valley Airport itself, although if I back up kind of the time slider, again, Deer Valley off the top of my head is ballpark 1,500 feet. Field elevation, sorry, I didn't mean the right click. So he's going by, he's already at 5,000 plus AGLs. He's climbing out of the turbocharged Mooney and so on. If I move the time thing a little farther, he's somewhere right up about here. So he's a little south of what we call the 303 in that area, kind of north of Pyramid Peak, when that's where he has the engine failure. So let's kind of get our bearings here for a second. In order to do some measurements, I'm going to come out of this. I'm going to go back to Google Maps for a second, but just kind of snapshot visually where this is. He is more or less equidistant between Pleasant Valley and Deer Valley. Glendale is farther away down here, kind of east from Luke Air Force Base. So he's approximately here when he has the engine failure, and we're going to do our own measurements. I realize this is statute miles, not nautical, but we're talking just over 8 statute out to Deer Valley Airport. For what it's worth, Pleasant Valley, come on, internet, load and make this a little better. Pleasant Valley is only about 4 miles away, so it's clearly the closest airport. And to find Glendale, Glendale is down, let me zoom in, make sure it loads. I'm not sure where the NTSB is getting their preliminary distance of 12. It's actually about 17. Okay, so the NTSB is just factually wrong on that little detail. But for discussion purposes, let's think about this. So you have a choice of this one that's granted. It's a dirt strip. Okay, it has 3 parallel runways that are more or less bulldozed out of the desert. There's a crosswind runway. They're all ballpark 4,000-ish feet long. So granted it's a dirt runway, and a Phoenix approach probably doesn't deal with any airplanes out of there practically ever. Okay, I am a little surprised that the choice was between Glendale and Pleasant Valley. And at this point in time, I do not have access to the ATC transcripts. So I cannot speak intelligently with full understanding about the way it was presented to the pilot. But generally speaking, when you have an engine failure situation, what you really want to do is make sure you kind of start with any airports that are reachable. And this one, even though it's a dirt runway, happens to be particularly visually distinctive and so on. Now, most of you are kind of wondering, why did the controller offer Glendale 17 miles or so away across an urban area, if you're thinking ahead of me on this, instead of Deer Valley? Clearly, the choice should have been at least between Pleasant Valley, the dirt strip, or Big Old Tower, Deer Valley. Again, local knowledge is helpful, and let me kind of extrapolate a little bit. A lot of these airports, let me kind of go back to FlightAware for a second and kind of zoom out. This is relatively typical. Obviously, there's a lot of variability, but it's relatively typical that when you get to some urban area like a Phoenix, Arizona, Phoenix Sky Harbor Airport is surrounded by urban area for miles around. Okay, fortunately, it's not a whole lot of single-engine aircraft. It's more airliners out there. But then around this kind of big urban area, you tend to have a whole bunch of airports. So in no particular order, and I'm going to skip like dirt airports like Papa 48, private airports like Carefree and Luke Air Force Base because it's a military base, but like Goodyear, Glendale, Deer Valley, Scottsdale, Mesa's Falcon Field, Chandler. That's the former Williams Air Force Base. It's now a civilian airport, I believe, although I don't keep track of it. Basically, those tend to kind of be outside the dense urban area. So the general rule of thumb, even before you start to look at your own airspace, is generally speaking, outside the urban area, statistically, you have much better options for forced landings, and you want to think twice as a controller before you bring them into the urban area. From here, you can kind of get a sense, again, that from the engine failure point down to Glendale, you're going to take them across quite a bit of urban area, and this guy's going to have some bad choices to make. Having said that, let's track what happened. So the pilot chose Glendale, turns to the south, starts to go towards runway 19. Again, I don't have access to the ATC transcripts. It might be that if you picture the geometry to runway 19, he's more or less going to do straight in, and controllers, I don't know, maybe a controller's thinking, oh, he can go straight into Glendale, as opposed to having to make some turns for Deer Valley. I'm just going to tell you right now, let them make the turns. Turns are not a problem in the engine failure situations. I would much, much, much rather go to a nearby airport and make a couple turns than go to something farther away just because it happens to be lined up. Now, if it's an airport a mile away and the other one you're lined up for is 4 miles away, that might be fine. So you got to use some judgment there. But anyway, so he starts heading off for Glendale, and then a few minutes later as he's descending, it says the pilot decided he was not going to reach Glendale. Again, I don't have the ATC transcript, so I cannot speak intelligently to how much the pilot made that decision on his own or how much that was ATC saying, hey, if you want it, there's a second choice. It's Deer Valley off the left side, and the pilot maybe elects to go to Deer Valley. Either way, the pilot realizes he's not going to reach Glendale. He turns east towards Deer Valley, which at that point is about 8 miles away. By the way, that's about how far he was from the airport when it first started, but he's basically lost about half of his AGL altitude already. No other transmissions from the pilot were recorded. The track continued on its eastern track towards the airport before it ends about 2 miles short of the airport. He ends up, and you can kind of see this one coming, once we start heading for an airport, it's something of a double or nothing proposition. This is where the track ends. That white line is what FlightAware is thinking is where he's going to try to go. He ends up on Deer Valley Road at about 31st Avenue. And that's going to put him right about here. And so where he came down, it's a little hard to tell in this here, but there are big power lines on one side of the road. The pilot's dodging cars, power lines, houses, and he ends up with the airplane down over here. Full disclosure, let me kind of quietly look at something on Catherine's report for a moment. It says fatal accident. If you note, though, the NTSB preliminary report, which came out a few days after the accident, it says one serious. The pilot was the sole occupant on board. This is going to repeat what it said in the NTSB preliminary report, so I'm going to kind of skip that, take you to a linked news story. I'll let you read this just for a moment without comment. This guy risked his own life to help the pilot. He was able to pull the pilot out, but as you read, he kind of fought for a few months before he succumbed to his burn injuries and so on. These are real people. I never, ever want to forget that. At some level, and I do kind of hate to be serious about it, but we have to acknowledge the fact that as controllers, if we're going to up our game, we need to be aware of the context when we're dealing with engine failure situations. So at the moment, I'm actually kind of even ignoring the Glendale thing. This is another example of a lot of controllers, even if we think, oh, we're not going to do something like send them off to Glendale, we're going to do the right thing and send them to Deer Valley. And yes, it turns out with this particular geometry, he could have made it. When we head for an airport in an urban area, it's something of a double or nothing proposition. Sometimes it's better to send them to an airport where there are other forced landing options within the region, and who knows? I cannot vouch for what would have happened. It's possible this guy with the Mooney would have hit a rock and had something of a similar outcome and so on. But statistically, we're better to maybe not send them into airports that are surrounded by urban areas within 3 miles or so. Okay, let's move on a little bit. Let's look at a Civil Air Patrol Cessna 182 that had engine trouble west of Houston back in 2018 and be a little more positive this time.
Cat 4225, Houston approach.
Yeah, I'm southwest of the Pari intersection, and I'm looking for a support. I think I'm going to go ahead and declare an emergency. I'm losing manifold pressure. I was wondering if you could direct me to the nearest airport.
Cat 4225, just squawk emergency for me so I can see where you're at.
All right.
And Cab 4225, your radar contact 15 miles west of Houston Executive Airport, and Houston Executive Airport's 15 miles to your east there. You also got Eagle Lake Arrival 15 miles to the southwest there.
Okay, let's see here. How about Eagle Lake?
And Cab 4225, Eagle Lake Airport, that's your 11 o'clock and 15 miles. And can you say the nature of emergency, fuel on board, and souls on board when you can?
One soul on board, 3 hours of fuel, and I'm losing manifold pressure.
Cab 4225, roger.
I will pause here and kind of cut to the chase. Of course, as always, you're welcome to watch the full video, but for context, he basically does a fine job giving him two options. Brilliant move, by the way, having him squawk emergency for very rapid identification, and he gives him the two closest airports. Coincidentally, they're ballpark each about 15 miles away. One I believe is that one I believe is that one. Don't quote me if I don't have the airports exactly correct. It might be that one for the Houston Executive. Okay, but if you picture the geometry, we're going to play with this. It turns out if you watch the video, he's going to get up to about 4,000 feet. He's going to report that the engine's stable, and he does make it successfully to Eagle Lake. Everything's fine. Here's where I'm going with this. What can we as controllers do in this intervening time period? And again, I do like the fact that we are, again, even before you look at it, you kind of get the impression this is probably an urban area. Houston Executive is probably more or less on the edge of the urban area. Doesn't mean nobody lives out here, but this should be statistically better. And so if you can, oops, I didn't mean to change windows. I keep doing that. Let's go back to Flight Aware, and I'm just going to zoom out, and we're just going to kind of picture the flight track for this aircraft. Okay, for what it's worth, here's Eagle Lake. Here's Tango, Mike, Echo, and so on. And I believe the airplane was somewhere up about here. If you just picture that geometry on the video, he was coming on about a 200, 210 towards Eagle Lake. And so we're going to kind of use that for discussion purposes. Now, here's the thing. In this case, it's good that the airplane is stable and we've got them headed in the right direction, and that's fine. That seems quite reasonable. We're not sending them over an urban area. However, and full disclosure, I don't know what all was going on behind the scenes. I suspect what I'm going to propose was probably not going on behind the scenes. If you can, get another controller who, because again, this guy's got 15 miles or so to go, okay, and he's not diverting to that airport we didn't realize was 8 miles away. There's a couple little, small grass strip kind of things as indicated by the white dots in a second. But if you can, and just imagine that on Flight Aware or something like that, we're sort of live tracking the airplane. It's running about a minute behind. We can't vouch for exactly where the airplane is, but it's actually good enough for kind of strategic purposes. For discussion purposes, I'm going to assume that the pilot was right about here, and I think this is quite reasonable given what actually happened, and he's on his way to Eagle Lake. Have another controller get on something like Flight Aware or Flight Radar 24, track up the airplane's call sign. Okay, and what you can do is you can try to spot airports along the way so that even if they're not ideal, the pilot can at least consider them. It's up to the pilot to decide what to do, but you can also help them find airports that are otherwise really tough to find. So for example, let me just very quickly go to SkyVector for a second, and I've already got this kind of in on the area. So here's Houston Executive, Tango Mike Echo, here's Eagle Lake, Echo Lima Alpha, and the pilot is somewhere up over here. You'll notice that along the way, and I'm going to ignore this Grawender. I don't know much about the airport, and I'm just going to skip it for discussion purposes. I'm going to assume it doesn't exist. Don't anybody get mad at me if I should be going back and the controller should have offered this one. For discussion purposes, let's assume those are the only two quote-unquote real airports that are close and by. All right, so along the way, it looks like he's going to overfly maybe 3 or 4 of these kind of private grass strips. There's this Brandis. It's only 2,200 feet. It's probably a grass strip. Those typically aren't great. Mario's, 2,000 feet. Okay, Wren's, 1,600 feet. That's pretty short. Braden at 2,600 feet. So these are maybe viable, but maybe these are grass strips and so on. But if you can, during the time it's going to take the pilot to more or less overfly these, okay, kind of at least give the pilot a heads up. And if you're smart, you can do something like what I'm going to show you with Flight Aware to help find these visually. So for example, I'm going to start with Mario's, and here's why. What I see when I look at Mario's is it's right on apparently the south side of the interstate. Interstates are very visually distinctive to a pilot who's flying, and so sometimes what you can do is tell them look immediately south of the interstate, and so that's kind of what we're going to do here. So let's go over to Flight Aware. Okay, let's kind of imagine that he's coming along this way. For what it's worth, because we have the white dots, it's going to help us find that. That one may or may not be tough to find. If we're going to describe it to somebody, let's say we're tracking him over here, just FYI, there's a small grass strip. It's immediately southeast of a town. You might see it roughly 2 o'clock, 3 miles, okay? And by describing it in relation to something like a town, okay, it's up to the pilot, and the pilot may or may not see, and actually it looks like it's paved, but the pilot might look at that and go, yuck, that's got trees on one end, it's short, I'm going to skip it, and so on. But inform the pilot, and so even though this Civil Air Patrol pilot, his engine lasted until he got to Eagle Lake and he was fine, okay, give them at least the options. Let's kind of continue that track south. This one down here, okay, this one's tough. I don't see anything that's like visually distinctive in the area. I mean, there's a little pond, but this one's just kind of out in the middle of a bunch of fields. That one's tough to describe to the pilots, and frankly, even zooming in, I'm kind of thinking maybe this is the area that's intended for the runway, but I'm not even positive about that, okay? Remember that Mario's one, though, as we're heading off towards the interstate? Let's see if we can find it. Again, not just because we're cheating here on FlightAware. Immediately south of the interstate, just east of like a creek, and right next to a drag strip of some kind is a grass strip. Now, if you just tell somebody, you know, look, 1 o'clock and 4 miles, these grass strips can be really tough to find because they don't get the little white dots and the icons when they look out the windshield in the real world. But if you describe it as immediately south of the interstate, just between the drag strip and the creek, man, suddenly it becomes so easy to find when you're stressed dealing with a rough running engine of some kind, okay? And who knows, that pilot may look at this one, and even though it's a grass strip, and I forget the number, but it was ballpark 2,000 feet, might go, yeah. And that one, you know, this engine is slowly running rougher and rougher. I think I'm going to call it a day, and I'm going to head for Mario's Flying Pizza Airport. Who knows what I'll get to eat after I land, or even sometimes if you're tracking on FlightAware and there are no airports like this, we might get lucky, okay? And you just happen to notice and try to predict where the airplane is going to go and happen to see if there's anything that particularly stands out as a non-airport great forced landing site. And I'll tell you what, a drag strip? Wow, that's probably pretty darn good. That's probably better than Mario's Flying Pizza Airport and so on. Let the pilot make the decision. Who knows? This Civil Air Patrol pilot might have elected to land at the drag strip where he would be met by the fine people who would pick him up in a really, you know, supercharged Dodge Viper or something from Hennessy Performance. And you'd have a really cool day, plus maybe some pizza from a guy named Mario. All right, so keep an open mind and take the time and try to see what's along the way. Help describe airports using visually distinctive landmarks. Last of these, we're going to talk about controller psychology, where the controller does a pretty good job, but kind of lets one thing kind of slip through the cracks. We're going to look at a Mooney that had an engine problem near Baton Rouge back in 2017. Inbound to Baton Rouge anyway. He's inbound for landing. He's descending. Suddenly he has an oil pressure problem. He ends up in a farm field 5 miles northeast of the airport. Fortunately, both on board resulted uninjured. That is not always the case. There's always some luck, so let's be careful about just assuming everybody's going to walk away from all these. Sometimes it's a much sadder result.
Baton Rouge approach, Mooney 114, Golf, descending out of 10 for 7,000.
Mooney 1147 Golf, Baton Rouge approach, altimeter 29908, heading.
360.
Mooney 1147 Golf, ready to maintain 7,000 for now.
47 Golf, and we need to stay near the field. Our oil pressure is wavering.
I'm going to stop here. As always, you're welcome to watch the full video. She does treat him as an emergency. We can tell that from a couple of hints if you watch the video, including she has an airliner on final, and she tells him to cancel approach clearance, turn off in kind of this direction, climb back out. We're bringing the Mooney in first. For what it's worth, and you would see this if you go farther a little bit here. In fact, I'll bring it to here. Oh, sorry, not that one. I think it's this one. The ceiling was 2,500 broken. At 2,500 broken, this isn't 800's overcast, okay? 800 overcast, it becomes a bit trickier, but 2,500 broken, or certainly if it's totally VFR, not a cloud in the sky kind of a thing. When the pilot was back here and said he had an oil pressure problem and wanted to stay near the airport, on the one hand, the controller did keep him near the airport because she moved other airplanes and kept him in somewhat close, but when the pilot's here and asked to be kept close to the airport, what pilots mean, again, this becomes a little bit trickier when it's truly, IFR, low IFR. But when pilots asked to remain near the airport, what they really mean is, can I stay within the gliding range of the airport? With hindsight, it is easy to see that in this situation, what should have been done was to vector the airplane maybe like this, and back like this, and a little bit of a close-in box pattern within a couple miles of the airport. Even if he doesn't see it right away because of the clouds, the ceiling is high enough that somewhere 2,500 feet-ish AGL, who knows which side of the airport he'll be on when he sees it, but he's looking out the left side the whole time. It's a great sight line. He breaks out, and if the engine keeps running, fine. Then it's a fairly normal landing and everything's totally fine. However, if the engine fails a couple minutes after an oil pressure problem results, okay, he should be able to glide into the airport. But here we started practically on top of the airport and we took him out of gliding range, and you kind of know what's going to happen. He's going to have an engine failure somewhere about here. He's going to head for the airport because that's kind of the default thing we do. Fortunately, it's not an urban area. He ends up in a farm field out here, and fortunately, they got out uninjured. Keep in mind, there's not always a guarantee that you're just going to walk out uninjured because you land in a farm field. All right, so enough of those. We're going to do one more, and this one's going to be a quick, self-evident illustration about human psychology, because I argue that what we're about to see and what we've been talking about is really a manifestation of what people do even during serious emergencies where we maybe don't think about it properly. I'm asking for us to step up our game. So without comment, we're going to conclude by looking at just about a minute and a half of this video here.
Images of plane crash survivors walking away from a burning wreck, bags in hand, has prompted worldwide anger and disbelief. 41 people on board the Russian superjet were killed when it burst into flames at Moscow airport. But aviation experts believe those ahead condemned to death the passengers behind them by stopping to collect their carry-on luggage. A warning, some people may find parts of this story distressing.
A plane burning with 78 people still inside. Panicked and screaming passengers, the speed of the aircraft then fanned the flames. And within seconds of it stopping, the emergency slides were deployed. But because the entire rear section was burning, those emergency exits back there weren't usable. That left the two front doors the only way out. A plane of this size should have been emptied in 90 seconds, but sources say the evacuation was delayed by some passengers insisting on taking their hand luggage out of the overhead lockers. That would have caused a backup in the single-aisle plane and more panic as the flames and smoke started eating into the cabin.
I'm going to end it there. As always, you're welcome to watch the whole video. I'm calling on controllers to step up our game. When pilots say they have a rough running engine or an oil pressure problem, I want us to immediately treat that as an emergency, regardless of whether the pilot says it's an emergency or not. Now, each situation will be unique in terms of the handling required, but in some of these cases, one of the ways we can step up our game is be mindful of the intervening area. Don't just head for an airport and ignore the context in which that airport exists. If there is some time during a rough running engine event when they're heading towards an airport, take a look at what the options are going to be on the way in. It's going to have to be done quickly, but we can do that with just a little bit of practice. It doesn't take much, and that's the way we can step up our games. So we're not like a pilot who has oil spraying all over the windshield and says, I've got no problem at all, or a passenger of a plane that's burning while it's rolling and sliding sideways who nonetheless grabs their bags on the way out of the airplane. Thank you.